What would you do if your wife texted at 6 a.m. that she had no signal, then showed up 30 minutes later with suitcases already packed, and you realized the friend's place she named never had bad reception, only bad lies? My name is Jack Holt, and I learned at 6 a.m. that a lie can arrive dressed as an apology. My phone buzzed on the nightstand with that thin, sharp vibration that always feels louder in the dark, and I saw her message before my eyes were fully open. Sorry, no signal, just saw your message. The words were casual, almost lazy, like she had tossed them over her shoulder while walking away from something she did not want to explain. And what bothered me most was how normal it tried to sound. Elise knew I was awake early because I always was, and she knew I never called twice unless something was wrong, so the timing felt less like coincidence and more like a decision. I stared at the screen until the letters stopped looking like letters and started looking like a practiced line, something she had repeated in her head to make sure it landed clean. I replied with the first thing that came to mind, the only thing that mattered. Since when does my friend have bad signals at his place? I did not add a question mark to soften it, because softness is a kind of permission, and I was done giving permission in the dark. The room was quiet, in the way a house gets when it thinks the day has not started yet, and the quiet made the lie echo. Outside, the street lights threw pale rectangles onto the curtains, and the air smelled like stale detergent and last night's rain, which was a smell that always reminded me of endings. Elise had not come home after her so-called late meeting, and she had not called, and I had told myself I would not chase her, because chasing turns you into a character in someone else's story. Still, my mind kept turning over the same small facts, the kind of facts people ignore because they are too ordinary to be dramatic. Her charger left behind, her laptop bag missing, the way she kissed my cheek before leaving yesterday like she was checking a box. When you work my job, you learn that the truth is rarely a single big event, and usually a chain of tiny consistencies that only look random when you refuse to count them. I lay there listening to the refrigerator hum, and I thought about the friend she had named last night, Grant Vale, a man I had introduced to our house as a vendor contact, a harmless professional link, a guy who smiled too wide and laughed too quickly, like he needed people to like him before they had a chance to think. His place, I knew, was in the city, in a new building that probably had a lobby that smelled like fresh paint and money. And in buildings like that, signal is not something you lose. Signal is something you pay for, and people like Grant paid for everything they wanted. I got up without waking the house in any obvious way, because I did not want to start the day by admitting I was afraid. The kitchen tile was cold under my feet, and the coffee maker clicked like it was clearing its throat, and I watched the dark liquid pour as if it could tell me something useful. I had a habit of moving slowly when my emotions tried to sprint, because speed makes mistakes, and mistakes become leverage for the person you are trying to expose. Elise had built her whole public identity on being composed and competent, the kind of woman who ran meetings and ran rooms and made other people feel slightly lucky to be in her orbit, and part of that identity was the illusion that she never lost control. If I met her energy with heat, she would call me unstable, and if I begged, she would call me needy, and either way, she would write the story before I ever opened my mouth. So I drank my coffee and stared at the clock, and I let the minutes pass as if I had all the time in the world. At 6:15, I checked my phone again, and there was no reply, which made my earlier message feel like a stone thrown into deep water, the kind that does not splash, but still sinks. At 6:22, I heard a car door slam outside, followed by the uneven roll of suitcase wheels on the front path. That sound, more than anything, made my stomach tighten, because it was not the sound of someone returning home, and it was the sound of someone arriving with a plan. I walked to the living room and stood where I could see the front door without being seen from the window, because habit teaches you to avoid silhouettes when you do not know what someone else is carrying. The lock turned, and Elise stepped inside at 6:30 with the kind of calm that feels too polished for this hour. Wearing the same coat she had left in yesterday, her hair arranged like she had looked in a mirror more than once. Behind her, 2 suitcases followed like obedient dogs, both of them zipped and tagged, both of them packed the way you pack when you do not intend to come back soon. She paused when she saw me, and in that half-second, I watched her face choose which version of herself to wear, and she landed on tired but reasonable, the expression that says, life happened to her, and she is handling it. The problem with an expression like that is, it only works when you do not know how many options were rejected before it appeared. She set the suitcase handles down, and the silence between us swelled up like smoke. I did not ask where she had been, because that question is a gift, and she would have wrapped it in whatever story she wanted. Instead, I asked how she got back so fast, because speed is measurable, and measurable things make liars nervous. Elise blinked once, then told me she had trouble with reception and could not respond earlier, and that she had just seen my message, and that the night had gotten complicated. She said complicated like it was a weather condition, like it had rolled in without warning, like she had no part in it. I watched her hands as she spoke, because hands always confess, and her fingers kept touching the zipper pull on the nearer suitcase, as if she needed to remind herself it was closed. She tried to look at my eyes and hold them, but she kept glancing at my phone on the coffee table, as if she feared it might speak before she was ready. That glance told me more than any explanation, because people only fear objects when objects contain evidence. I did what I always do when someone expects a reaction, and I gave her something else instead. I nodded slowly, like I was listening, and I stepped to the side, giving her space to move deeper into the house, because people relax when they think the exit is not blocked. Elise walked 2 steps toward the hallway, then stopped, because the suitcases made her movement feel like a confession she could not hide. I asked her, in the same even voice I used with angry clients and nervous claimants, why she had packed. She said she had not packed, not really, and that she had only grabbed essentials, and that she needed time to think. Time to think was her favorite phrase, the phrase she used when she wanted the benefit of uncertainty without the burden of accountability. The suitcases were not essentials, and they were not thinking, and they were not temporary, and the moment she tried to shrink them into something smaller, I knew she was already lying about the shape of her own intent. The truth is, I had seen this before, just not with her. In my line of work, people sit across from you with watery eyes and carefully chosen words, telling you a version of events that serves them, and they rely on your discomfort to keep you from asking the next question. They want you to be polite enough to stop, compassionate enough to accept ambiguity, and tired enough to sign off. Elise was using the same tactic now, the same controlled vagueness, the same soft framing, and she expected my marriage to make me less precise than my job did. That expectation was insulting, and it lit something cold inside me because it meant she thought love was a weakness she could exploit. I watched her for another beat. Then I asked her what she meant by no signal, because her friend lived in a building where elevators streamed music and the lobby had full bars, and buildings like that do not have dead zones. Elise's mouth tightened, just for a second, and she said, maybe his internet had issues, and maybe her phone had died, and maybe she had been stressed and not thinking clearly. When a person starts stacking maybes, it is because the real answer is too sharp to touch. She tried a different angle then, the angle that usually worked on me when we were still pretending everything was fine. She told me she had been overwhelmed, that work had been a mess, that Nadia Pike had been pushing deadlines, that her team needed her, that she could not always be reachable. She spoke fast, like the speed of her words could outrun the weight of her absence. She also used my friend's name only once, and then she avoided it, calling him just a friend, just a place to crash, just a safe couch. That avoidance was not accidental, and it was a pattern, and patterns are where the truth hides. I let her talk until she ran out of air because I wanted to hear which parts she repeated, which parts she emphasized, and which parts she tried to bury under just. When she finished, she looked at me like she was waiting for my anger to make her feel justified. I did not give her that relief. Instead, I asked her one simple question, the kind of question that sounds harmless until it is not. I asked her why she came back at 6:30 if she had just seen my message at 6. Elise's eyes widened a fraction, then narrowed, and she said she drove fast, and she did not want to wake me, and she did not want to make a scene. The problem was, she had already made a scene, and she had brought the props. I walked to the coffee table and picked up my phone, and as I did, I saw her shoulders tense as if she expected an attack. That tension told me she had more to hide than she was admitting, and it also told me she was thinking about her own phone, about what might be on its screen, about what might appear if it lit up at the wrong time. I did not reach for her device, and I did not ask to see it, because that would turn me into the villain she wanted. I simply watched, and I waited, because people who are hiding something always end up checking it. Elise glanced down at her coat pocket, and her hand moved toward it, then stopped, like she remembered I was watching. She tried to smile, but the smile did not reach her eyes, and she said she was going to take a shower and sleep, and then we could talk later when we were calm. Calm was the last word a guilty person uses when they are trying to delay consequences. She reached for the suitcase handle again, and I saw a faint smear of something dark on the side of the bag, like it had been dragged across a curb, and I noticed the luggage tag was not one of ours. It was a cheap paper tag, the kind you get at hotels and conferences and events, the kind that says you were somewhere official enough to be labeled. Elise saw me looking, and she shifted the suitcase slightly so the tag faced away, and that small movement, that tiny attempt at concealment, landed harder than a shouted confession. I let her walk past me, because my plan was not to stop her, and my plan was to document her. I followed her with my eyes as she went down the hall, and I listened to the bathroom door close, and then I listened to the water start, and I stood in the living room with 2 packed suitcases and a quiet house, and I felt the day turn into something else. In my head, I began an evidence ledger without writing it down yet, because the first step is always naming what is true. 6 o'clock text, no signal excuse, 6:30 arrival, suitcases packed, hotel tag present, avoidance of a name, repeated phrases, and the biggest fact of all, she came back ready to leave again. I could fight her in private and lose, or I could let the truth do what it always does when you present it cleanly, in order, without emotion. I looked at the suitcases one more time, then I turned toward the kitchen and the drawer where we kept paper and pens, because I already knew how this would end, and I knew I was done being the only one surprised. I sat at the kitchen table with a pen that suddenly felt heavier than it should, and I stared at a blank sheet of paper, like it was the only witness in the house who would not lie to me. The shower ran down the hall in a steady hiss, and the sound was almost comforting until I remembered it was also a timer, because every minute she had alone was a minute she could erase, rehearse, and rearrange the day into something more convenient. I wrote the first line anyway, because the simplest discipline is the one that saves you when your mind starts bargaining. Day 1, 6 a.m., message received, no signal excuse. I wrote the second line, then the third, and I kept the language flat, because flat language does not drift into feelings, and feelings are where people get sloppy. I included the arrival time, the suitcases, the cheap tag I had glimpsed, and the way she avoided saying his name more than once, and I even wrote down the precise order of her excuses, because when someone is lying, the order becomes part of the lie. I had learned that in conference rooms with people who swore they never saw the puddle before they slipped, and I learned it again in my own kitchen while my wife washed her guilt off in hot water. When the water stopped, I did not rush, because rushing is the sound of panic, and panic is the sound that invites the other person to steer. I folded the paper once, then twice, and I put it in a plain envelope from the junk drawer, and I did not seal it, because I was not trying to make it dramatic, and I was not trying to make it final, and I was not interested in the theater of suffering. I placed the envelope under my insurance folder in the cabinet, the one place Elise never touched because it bored her, and boredom is the best hiding place in a marriage. Then I cleaned the coffee cup, wiped the counter, and made the house look normal, because normal is a mask that lets you move through public spaces without triggering suspicion. The trick, I reminded myself, was to behave like a man who had nothing to hide, because I didn't, and to let her behave like someone who did, because she did. A calm house is a stage, and on that stage liars always overact. Elise came out wrapped in a towel, hair damp, face bare, and for a moment she looked like the version of her I once trusted, which was the cruelest part. She avoided the suitcases, stepping around them like they were not there, and she avoided my eyes for a beat too long, then tried to correct it by looking directly at me, as if that would count as honesty. She told me she needed rest. She said her head was a mess, and she asked for space in the same way people ask for a favor they already feel entitled to. I nodded, because my plan was not to win an argument, and my plan was not to convince her, and my plan was to collect reality in small pieces until it was too heavy for her to carry. She moved down the hall again, this time toward the bedroom, and I watched her take her phone out of her pocket with the reflexive urgency of someone checking a vital sign. The screen lit up for half a second before she turned away, and in that half second I saw enough to confirm what I already suspected: a notification banner, the start of a name, and the word that matters most in a cover story, the word that tells you someone is coordinating, not just confessing. The word was tonight, and the name started with a G, which narrowed the world down to one particular smile. I did not grab the phone, because grabbing turns you into the crime scene, and I did not ask what it said, because asking invites performance. Instead, I did what I have done in 100 claims when a person tells me they lost something they never owned, and I noted the time, the angle, the context, and the visible fragment, and I wrote it down the moment I was alone. I stood at the counter and pretended to check the weather, but I was really checking my own pulse, because I wanted to know if I was still capable of staying steady. Being steady is not a personality trait. It is a choice you make every time your emotions demand a shortcut. Elise disappeared into the bedroom, and I heard a drawer open, then close, then open again, the sound of someone reorganizing a life in real time. A minute later, I heard the zipper of a suitcase, soft but unmistakable, and that sound told me she was not packing to leave, because she already was packed, and she was packing to control what I could see. By late morning, she was dressed again, makeup in place, posture rebuilt, and the suitcases sat by the door like quiet threats. She told me she was going to stay with her sister for a few days, because she needed space and because she didn't want tension in the house. I listened, and I said nothing that could be twisted later, because anything you say in this moment becomes a quote in someone else's retelling. Elise moved as if she expected me to block her, and when I didn't, she looked briefly disappointed, because disappointment is what you feel when your opponent refuses to play the role you rehearsed for them. She rolled the suitcases out, paused by the door, and gave me a look that was meant to be sad, but landed as annoyed. Then she left, and the house returned to silence, and I felt that hollow space open up where routine used to live. The silence didn't hurt, not yet, because shock is a kind of anesthesia, and the pain usually waits until the facts are clear. I checked my phone after she drove away, and my screen showed a merchant notification from my bank app, the kind that usually makes you roll your eyes and move on. This one didn't let me move on, because it was a charge from a boutique hotel cafe across town, time stamped before dawn, the exact time window when she claimed she had no signal and had only just seen my message. It was not a huge amount, not the kind of charge that screams scandal, which is exactly why it mattered, because small charges are the kind people forget to cover. My account, my notification, my timestamp, and my wife's alibi, all in one neat, ugly line. I opened the details and saw the merchant name again. Then I took a screenshot and saved it in a folder I labeled Receipts, because I was done pretending my life didn't need categories. I wrote the time next to the first line in my paper ledger, and I underlined it once, not for drama, but because it connected two events that she wanted separated. The rest of the day, I moved like someone completing ordinary tasks, because ordinary tasks keep you from spiraling. I went to work, I answered calls, I listened to people explain why their accidents were no one's fault, and I felt the ironic comfort of professional dishonesty compared to personal dishonesty. At least in my job, the lies were transactional, not intimate, and at least in my job, the lies did not wear my favorite sweater and sleep in my bed. I kept my tone even, and I kept my smile small, and I let nobody see the fracture in my attention. Around noon, Rowan Pierce stopped by my desk under the pretense of dropping off a form, and their eyes lingered on my face just long enough to show concern without asking for details. Rowan was the kind of coworker who watched patterns the way other people watched sports, and when they noticed something, it was usually real. They said Elise hadn't been in the building since yesterday afternoon, which I already knew, but hearing it said out loud gave it weight. I thanked Rowan, then returned to my screen, because I didn't want an ally to become a witness before I was ready. As the workday dragged, I noticed other small things that would have meant nothing a week ago, and now meant too much. A calendar invite in our shared family calendar popped up and vanished, like someone had created it and then remembered it, left a trace. I didn't need access to anything secret to see that, because shared calendars are designed to be seen, and because Elise had used it for years to coordinate dinners, errands, and birthdays, trusting the comfort of routine. The invite title had been generic, something like meeting, but the location field flickered long enough for my brain to catch two words: Vale Consulting. The irony was almost funny, in a dry, bitter way, because she couldn't even lie creatively. She just lied confidently. I opened the calendar on my own device, scrolled to the week view, and exported it as a PDF the way a normal person might export travel plans. I saved it, then printed it at the office printer like it was a harmless work document, because printing turns digital fog into paper that does not change. I folded the pages and slid them into my bag, then went back to my desk and answered another call in the same calm voice, because calm is the only kind of armor that doesn't show seams. That evening, I went home to an empty house and made dinner I didn't want, because hunger still exists, even when trust doesn't. I ate standing up by the counter, and the quiet felt different now, not peaceful, but exposed, like the house was missing its furniture. Afterward, I opened the junk drawer again and pulled out another envelope, because I was starting to understand that my future depended on what I could prove, not on what I could feel. I placed the merchant alert screenshot behind the calendar export. Then I wrote a brief summary line in pen, dated and signed, because a signature forces you to respect your own memory. I was not building a revenge fantasy, and I was not building a courtroom drama, and I was building a simple ledger that could survive sunlight. When you show people a clean timeline, they don't have to like you to believe you, and that was all I needed. My phone buzzed around 10, and for a second my body reacted like it used to, like the buzz might mean she missed me. The message was from Elise, and it was written in the careful tone of someone crafting a record. She said she was safe. She said she needed time. She said she didn't want conflict, and she said she would talk soon. The words were neat and hollow, and they contained not a single detail that could be checked, which told me they were meant to be forwarded. I didn't reply right away, because replying right away makes you look eager, and eager people get managed. I waited, then sent one sentence that could not be twisted into anger and could not be twisted into apology. I told her to send me her sister's address, so I knew where she was staying. The pause that followed felt long, even though it was only minutes, and when her reply came, it wasn't an address. It was another excuse about being tired and not wanting to be interrogated. That refusal told me what the suitcases had already said. She wasn't going where she claimed, and she didn't want a location in writing. I set the phone down and looked at the printed calendar pages again, then at the merchant alert screenshot, then at my handwritten lines, and I realized I had crossed a quiet threshold. I wasn't guessing anymore, and I wasn't hoping anymore, and I wasn't bargaining with the idea that this could be misunderstood. I had the first pieces of a spine, and once a spine exists, the rest of the body follows. I turned off the lights, went upstairs, and lay in my bed alone, listening to the house settle the way it always did, except now every creak sounded like evidence. I closed my eyes and told myself I would not confront her in private, because private confrontations are where liars win and where calm men get framed. I would let her keep writing her story, and I would keep collecting the proof that would erase it. And somewhere in the dark, I felt the next step forming, not as anger, but as a plan. And plans are dangerous because they don't need permission to begin. Telling the truth about where she was, or she would have treated the address like a harmless detail instead of a trap. I stared at her refusal for a long minute, then set my phone down as if it had stopped mattering, because the moment you treat a liar's message like a negotiation, you are already losing. The house around me felt too still, like it was listening, and I realized I needed one thing more than comfort right now, which was control of my own narrative. I did not need to know every secret tonight, and I did not need to chase her into whatever room she thought was safe, and I needed to build a record so clean that nobody could claim it was just jealousy. Elise had always been good at making other people feel like they were overreacting, and she was good because she never raised her voice. She simply suggested you were emotional. So I decided I would become the least emotional man in the story, not because I was numb, but because calm has a way of stripping away excuses until only facts remain. The next morning, I woke before my alarm and stared at the ceiling for a few seconds, letting the first wave of anger pass without grabbing it like a rope. Then I got up, showered, dressed, and moved through the kitchen like it was any other workday, because routine is a weapon when you are trying not to fall apart. I checked my phone and saw no new messages from Elise, which told me she was either sleeping beside her lie or drafting a better one, and neither option did anything for me. I opened our shared calendar again, not to obsess, but to document, and I exported another week view, making sure the timestamps were visible. I printed it at home this time, then signed the back of the printout with the date, because a signature is a quiet promise that you will stand behind what you record. The act felt strange at first, like I was turning my marriage into paperwork, and then it felt inevitable, because my marriage had already been turned into paperwork by someone who packed suitcases before dawn. At the office, the air felt normal, which was almost insulting, because my life had changed shape, and the fluorescent lights did not even flicker in sympathy. Nadia Pike's name came up in a meeting about policy compliance, and I watched the way people shifted their posture when her standards were mentioned, because she had a reputation for being precise and merciless. Nadia ran HR like a courtroom, and she loved process more than people, which usually made her dangerous, unless you learned to speak her language. I listened more than I spoke, and I watched who looked at whom when Elise's absence was mentioned indirectly, as if her name was something the room did not want to touch. When the meeting ended, Rowan Pierce caught up with me near the printer and asked, carefully, if I was doing okay. I gave them a neutral answer, something about long nights and work stress, because I did not want Rowan to carry my truth before I had shaped it. Still, Rowan nodded like they understood more than I said, and they mentioned that Grant Vale had been seen in the building late last week, walking out with Elise after most of the team had left. Rowan did not say it like gossip, and they did not dramatize it, and that restraint made it feel more credible than any rumor. I thanked them, then asked in the calmest tone I could manage whether anyone else had noticed. Rowan said a few people had, but nobody wanted to be the first to call it what it looked like, because people prefer silence to risk, and I understood that preference too well. On my lunch break, I did something that would have felt pathetic a month ago, but now felt like simple due diligence. I went to my car, turned on the dashcam app, and checked the stored clips from the past few days, not because I expected to find a dramatic scene, but because my car, like my bank account and my calendar, was mine, and what was mine was allowed to tell me the truth. The clips were ordinary, mostly traffic and parking lots, but one file from the previous week caught my attention because it showed Elise sliding into the passenger seat for a quick errand she had insisted on, the kind of errand that had taken 2 hours and ended with her saying she got stuck in traffic. In the clip, I could hear her voice faintly, and I could see her glance at her phone with the same hungry urgency I had seen in our living room. The GPS stamp showed we had been near the boutique hotel that later appeared in my merchant alert, and the timestamps matched her now fractured alibi window. I took a still frame that showed the location stamp and date clearly, then saved it in the same folder as my other proof, because a ledger is only powerful when it stays organized. I did not celebrate, and I did not feel relief, and I felt something colder, something like the moment you realize the floor beneath you is not wood, it is thin glass, and it has already started to crack. That evening, I called my sister Mara, not because I needed someone to tell me what I wanted to hear, and because Mara was the only person I trusted to be blunt without being cruel. Mara picked up on the second ring, and I could tell by her voice she already knew something was wrong because sisters have a way of hearing pauses. I told her the basic facts, the 6 o'clock text, the 6:30 arrival, the suitcases, the refusal to give an address, and I kept my tone steady because I did not want pity to muddy the conversation. Mara listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said the one thing I needed to hear, which was that I should stop trying to extract the truth from Elise's mouth and start collecting it from the world around her. Mara told me that if Elise was already writing a narrative, then any emotional reaction would become proof of Elise's version, not mine. She said I should document, keep everything clean, and assume every message could be shown to someone else later, because it probably would be. I asked Mara if she thought I should confront Elise's sister, and Mara said no, because third parties become shields, and shields become excuses. Then Mara asked me if there were kids involved, and when I said no, she exhaled like she had been holding her breath, because custody changes the stakes in a way nothing else does. Still, Mara reminded me that even without kids, Elise could still try to wreck my reputation, and reputation is the currency you don't miss until someone freezes your account. The next day, Elise finally sent an address, and the timing of it made my mouth go dry. She sent it at noon, hours after I had asked, and she sent it like she was granting me a privilege, not answering a basic question. The address was her sister's, at least on paper, but the delay told me she had needed time to align stories, and alignment is what liars do when they realize the truth is being tracked. I replied with one word, okay, because more than that would sound like a conversation, and I did not want conversations anymore. I wanted records. Then I did something else, something small and lawful, because small lawful actions are harder to villainize. I sent Elise a simple request in writing, a list of the items she took from the house, so our home inventory stayed accurate for insurance purposes. The request was boring enough to be true, and true enough to be boring, and I knew she would hate it for that exact reason. She replied with irritation, asking why I was being like this, and I replied again with a neutral line about clarity and documentation. Her irritation told me she was expecting me to play a different game, a game where she could claim I was controlling, and my calm documentation was denying her that stage. At work, the rumors thickened the way fog does, slow and then suddenly everywhere. A team chat message popped up about Elise's project being reassigned temporarily, and someone made a joke about her being on a wellness reset, which was the corporate way of naming chaos without liability. I kept my face neutral and my hands steady because I could feel eyes on me, even if nobody said my name. Rowan sent me a quick note asking if I wanted to grab coffee after work, and I said yes, because I needed to know what people were seeing, and because I needed to know whether Elise was already planting seeds. We met at a small café near the office, the kind of place where people pretended they were relaxing while still checking email, and we sat in a corner where the noise would swallow details. Rowan told me, with careful phrasing, that Elise had been acting strange for weeks, leaving early, arriving late, always blaming meetings that never appeared on room schedules. Rowan said Grant Vale had been around more than he should, and that Nadia Pike had met with him twice, which did not fit his role as a vendor contact. That last detail made my stomach tighten, because it suggested Elise's affair might not be just personal, and it suggested it might be entangled with workplace power. Rowan did not accuse, and they did not push, and they only told me what they had seen, which made it useful. I thanked Rowan, then asked them not to share anything else about me, because I did not want my silence to become another rumor. Rowan nodded and said the office already sensed something was wrong, and that the only question was who would control the story first. On the drive home, I thought about that word, control, and I realized Elise's biggest advantage had always been her ability to control the emotional temperature in a room. She could make people laugh when she needed them soft, and she could make them feel guilty when she needed them quiet, and she could make them feel like they were overreacting when she needed them to doubt themselves. The suitcases were not just luggage, and they were a tactic, because leaving with bags makes you look like the victim of a hostile home. Her no-signal text was not just an excuse, and it was a buffer, something that bought her time to coordinate. The address she finally sent was not transparency, and it was damage control, because she realized silence was starting to look like guilt. She was building scaffolding, and my job now was not to scream at the scaffolding, and it was to remove one support at a time until it collapsed under its own weight. When I got home, I laid out my printed calendar exports, my merchant alert screenshots, and the dash cam still frame on the kitchen table, spacing them like an evidence board that refused to be dramatic. I created a one-page date-place payment table, keeping the language simple, because simple language is harder to argue with. I highlighted one line per proof with a marker, not because I enjoyed the ritual, but because clarity is a kind of mercy, even when you are being merciless. Then I put everything back into clear sleeves, labeled them by date, and placed them in a plain binder I had used for old insurance training notes. The binder looked dull and harmless, which was perfect because dull things are what survive. I washed my hands afterward, not because I was dirty, and because I needed the physical act to signal to my body that the next phase had started. Elise thought she could make me chase her into a private argument, and she thought she could make me react in a way that would justify her exit. Instead, I was building something she could not charm, something she could not cry at, something that would sit quietly in a room and outlast her performance. My phone buzzed again near midnight, and the message from Elise was softer this time, almost affectionate, as if she had decided to pivot back to intimacy as a weapon. She said she missed me. She said she hated how tense everything felt, and she asked if we could meet somewhere neutral to talk. I stared at the words and felt the old reflex to fix things twitch inside me like a dying habit. Then I looked at the binder on my table and remembered the suitcases in my living room at dawn, and I understood that neutral was her way of choosing a stage where she felt safe. I replied with a single sentence. We can talk after you confirm where you were last night. I did not ask for feelings, and I did not ask for apologies, and I asked for a fact. The pause that followed felt longer than it should, and when she finally replied, she did not confirm anything, and she only accused me of turning into someone cold. I read that line twice, then set my phone down, because she was right about one thing, and it was the only useful thing she had said in days. I was becoming cold, and cold was exactly what I needed to be, because heat was her territory, and I was done playing on her ground. By the time the weekend arrived, the office had already started doing what offices always do when something smells off, which is to pretend it is not smelling anything while quietly moving desks around the scent. Elise stayed out of the building. Her email replies came in short, polished bursts, and Nadia Pike's name kept surfacing in conversations like a warning label people pretended not to read. I kept showing up on time, kept my face steady, kept my voice level, and I let the world think I was simply tired, because tired is a socially acceptable mask for everything you are not allowed to admit. Inside, I was building a timeline that refused to bend, and I was learning to treat my own home like a place where facts mattered more than comfort. Elise texted less now, and when she did, each message sounded like a tiny legal brief, full of soft framing and careful distance, as if she wanted the record to show she was reasonable, and I was hard to live with. That would have worked on people who had not seen suitcases at dawn, and it would not work on me, because I was done confusing tone for truth. Mara called me Saturday morning and asked if I was eating and sleeping, the two questions family asks when they do not know what else to do. I told her I was fine, because fine is the lie you tell when you are trying to stay functional. Mara did not accept it, not because she wanted drama, but because she had known me long enough to recognize the difference between calm and numb. She said our parents were having a small family dinner Sunday evening, nothing formal, nothing big, just the kind of gathering that was meant to remind everyone we were still a family. She also said Elise had already told them she might not come, which was interesting, because it meant she had started shaping the story with my family before she had even offered me an honest address. Mara told me I should show up anyway, that I should sit at the table like a man who belonged there, and that I should keep my mouth shut unless someone asked a direct question. I understood what she was really saying, which was that silence is only a strategy when you occupy the room, and absence is how other people write you out. Sunday came with a gray sky and cold air that made the city look washed out, like someone had forgotten to load color into the day. I spent the afternoon doing small tasks that kept my hands busy, because idle hands are where your mind starts inventing catastrophes. I printed one more calendar view, not because I needed more paper, but because I wanted the week laid out clearly before I went into a room full of people who loved Elise's charm. I stapled the merchant alert screenshots in chronological order and kept them in my bag inside a plain folder, the kind you could mistake for work documents. I did not plan to show them to anyone at dinner, and I did not plan to accuse Elise in front of my parents, because public humiliation without a clean purpose turns you into the villain, and I was saving my public moment for a place where process mattered. Still, I knew family dinners have their own kind of pressure, and pressure makes people reveal patterns they would otherwise hide. Elise texted me an hour before dinner, saying she was not sure she would come, that she did not want tension, and that she hoped I would behave maturely. The message was so perfectly framed that I could almost see the invisible audience she was addressing, and that alone made my jaw tighten. I replied with a neutral line, telling her dinner started at 7 and that she was welcome to come. I did not add emotion, and I did not add sarcasm, because my goal was not to win a text exchange, and my goal was to keep my record clean. 10 minutes later, she replied that she would stop by briefly, and the speed of that decision told me she had already decided, and she had only wanted to test whether I would beg her to appear. When I did not beg, she pivoted to control through presence, which was predictable, and predictability is useful when you are building proof. My parents' house smelled like roast chicken, pepper, and the faint sweetness of baked apples, and the warmth inside made the cold air outside feel like a different world. My mother greeted me with a hug that lingered just a little too long, the kind of hug that says she senses something without wanting to name it. My father shook my hand, then patted my shoulder with the same practical firmness he used when he fixed a broken gate, as if physical contact could repair emotional damage. Mara was already there, moving around the kitchen like she belonged in every part of the house at once, and when she saw me, her eyes searched my face briefly, then nodded as if confirming I was still myself. We sat down at the table, and the conversation started the way it always started, with safe topics and familiar complaints, And I answered like a man whose marriage was not dissolving in slow motion. That was the strange thing about family, which is that everyone senses the crack, but nobody wants to be the first to describe the sound. Elise arrived at 7:22, late in the precise way she always used to be late when she wanted to remind the room that her time was valuable. She entered with a small smile and an apologetic shrug, wearing a coat that looked expensive and a scarf that looked carefully chosen, like she was stepping into a photo. My mother stood up immediately, because mothers are trained to protect the illusion of unity, and Elise accepted the warmth with practiced ease. She hugged my father, then hugged Mara, then turned to me and kissed my cheek lightly, the way you kiss a colleague you do not want to offend. The room watched that kiss like it was a weather report, and I could feel people measuring what it meant. Elise sat down, smoothed her napkin, and began speaking about work stress and exhaustion, like she was building a story brick by brick while the food was still hot. She used Nadia Pike's name twice, and she framed herself as overwhelmed, stretched thin, doing her best, and the performance was good enough that it might have convinced me once if I had not watched her carry suitcases across my living room at dawn. My father asked gently whether everything was okay between us, and Elise answered quickly, saying we were just in a rough patch and needed space, and she hoped I was respecting that. The way she emphasized space was not for my father, and it was for my mother, because my mother would interpret space as maturity and any resistance as aggression. I felt the trap forming, and I refused to step into it. I said we were both dealing with a lot, and I wanted things to stay calm for everyone. I kept my voice even, and I kept my words short enough to be safe, because if Elise wanted to paint me as unstable, she would need me to provide the paint. Mara watched Elise closely while she spoke, and I could tell Mara was listening not to the content, but to the structure. Elise's story had a rhythm to it, the kind of rhythm you hear when someone has rehearsed, and the rhythm did not change even when questions changed. Halfway through dinner, my mother mentioned a charity board gathering she had heard Elise attended recently, something about a committee meeting downtown. Elise blinked, then smiled, and said yes. She had been helping with planning because community work mattered to her. The problem was, that was not the story Elise had told me last week when she claimed she was working late, and it was not the story she had told Mara when she claimed she was at her sister's. I did not correct her out loud, and I did not interrupt, because the interruption would shift attention to my tone, not her facts. Instead, I asked, as casually as possible, what day that committee meeting had been, because dates are small knives. Elise hesitated for the shortest beat, then named a Thursday. Mara's eyes flicked to me because Mara remembered that Thursday was the night Elise's no-signal text had arrived, and the shared calendar showed a generic meeting block in the same time slot. Elise kept talking, trying to fill the space with details, describing the venue, the people, the planning stress, and she did it with the overconfidence of someone who believes specificity equals truth. My father asked if Grant was involved in that charity circle, because he vaguely remembered meeting him once at our house, and Elise's fork paused mid-air. She recovered fast, smiling and saying Grant was just a vendor contact and sometimes showed up at events because he knew people. The phrase, just a vendor contact, sounded too familiar, like it had been used too often, and that repetition was a tell. Mara asked, lightly, whether Elise had seen Grant recently, since he was always around. And Elise laughed in a way that was meant to be dismissive, then said she hadn't, not really, she was too busy, and anyway, she was trying to keep boundaries. Boundaries was an interesting word to use at a dinner table because nobody had asked about boundaries, and people only mention boundaries when they feel accused. I watched Elise's hands while she spoke, and I noticed something small and stupid, the kind of thing that would sound insane if you told it to someone who wanted a dramatic betrayal story. Her nails were freshly done in a color she never wore for family dinners, and the polish was too new, too glossy, too intentional, like she had prepared for someone else's gaze, not her in-laws' casual scrutiny. I also noticed she kept glancing at her phone on the table beside her plate, face down, as if she expected it to light up and rescue her. When it did buzz, she flinched slightly, then tried to mask it by reaching for her water glass. She picked the phone up, glanced quickly, and set it back down, and I caught the smallest flash of a notification banner, not the full content, but enough to see a name beginning with G and a short phrase that included the word "tonight" again. The repetition of that word was almost funny in a sick way, because it suggested her life was being scheduled by someone else's urgency. I did not grab her phone, and I did not demand to see it, because I did not want to become the spectacle. Instead, I did what I had trained myself to do, which was to note the time. The clock in my parents' dining room was old and loud, and it ticked with a steady confidence that made every minute feel official. Elise's phone buzzed at 8:47, and I carved that number into my memory like it mattered, because it did. My mother asked Elise if she could stay for dessert, and Elise said she could not. She had an early morning and a long day ahead, and she wanted to get home and rest. Home, she said, and she did not say whose home. I asked, still casually, if she meant her sister's place, and Elise's smile tightened again. That same microscopic strain that appeared whenever a factual detail threatened to trap her. She said yes, of course, her sister's, and she said it as if the question itself was rude. Elise left before dessert, hugging everyone with careful warmth, and when she hugged me, she whispered that we needed to talk privately soon, her tone carrying a warning disguised as affection. I did not answer in a whisper, because whispers are where people plant seeds, and I wanted all seeds planted in daylight. I simply nodded, stepped back, and watched her walk out, coat on, phone already in her hand, as if she could not bear the distance from it. The door closed, and the room exhaled in that collective way families do when a tense guest leaves. My mother looked at me with worry she was trying to hide, and my father asked, finally, what was really going on. Mara did not speak yet, because Mara was smart enough to let my parents ask the question first, so the answer would land with more weight. I kept my voice steady and told them the truth in the only form I could trust, which was the form of verifiable facts without interpretation. I said Elise had come home at 6:30 in the morning, with suitcases packed after claiming she had no signal at Grant's place, and I said she refused to give an address for hours, and I said her stories about where she had been kept changing. I did not say the word affair, because the word would ignite emotion and invite denial, and I wanted my parents to sit with the discomfort of inconsistency first. My father's face hardened in slow motion, and my mother's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall, because mothers hate admitting they misjudged someone. Mara reached across the table and touched my wrist briefly, grounding me, then told my parents that Elise's timeline did not match itself and that it was not about feelings anymore, it was about records. My father asked if I had proof, and I told him I was collecting it carefully, lawfully and quietly, because I would not be painted as unstable for asking one date too loudly. My father nodded once, and in that nod, I saw something shift, because respect is what you earn when you refuse to become messy. When I left my parents' house later, the cold air outside felt sharper, and the streetlights made the road look like a corridor leading somewhere unavoidable. In my car, I opened my notes app and wrote down the key moments of the dinner: Elise's arrival time, her conflicting charity story, the phone buzz at 8:47, the repeated language about boundaries, and the flash of Grant's name. Then I wrote one more line that mattered most, because it was the real change of the night. My family had seen the cracks, and Elise no longer had a clean audience there. I drove home with my hands steady on the wheel, and I felt the next phase tightening like a knot, because Elise had just chosen public storytelling over private honesty, and I had just secured the one thing she feared most, which was witnesses who cared about facts more than her charm. Monday morning arrived with the kind of gray light that makes every office window look like a confession booth, and I walked into the building the way you walk into a room where you already know somebody is lying. The lobby smelled like burned espresso and cheap cologne, and the security guard nodded at me with the same indifferent courtesy he gave everyone, which I appreciated, because I needed the world to stay normal while my private life turned into an evidence file. I took the elevator up, watched the numbers climb, and felt the calm settle in again, not because I was okay, but because calm was now my only reliable tool. At my desk, I opened my laptop, answered 2 routine emails, and forced my hands to move at a steady pace, because if you look shaken, people will decide why for you. Around me, colleagues spoke in their usual half-complaints about meetings and deadlines, but I noticed small pauses whenever Elise's name might have appeared, like the air itself was avoiding her. Her absence had turned into a kind of rumor magnet, and rumor magnets always pull in the wrong metal first. A calendar invite popped up mid-morning for a project continuity sync, and my first thought was that this was how organizations treat discomfort, by naming it something neutral and sliding it into a time slot. Nadia Pike ran these things like she ran everything, crisp, controlled, and mildly threatening, and the invite included her name as host, which made my spine tighten in the way it always does when I see a person who loves policy more than people. Elise was listed as optional, which was corporate code for, we are pretending she is still part of this while we plan like she is not. I saved the invite header because I had learned that headers are the bones of accountability, and then I returned to my work like I had never seen it, because nothing attracts attention faster than a man who suddenly looks too interested in administrative details. Still, my mind was turning over Rowan's comment about Grant Vale being seen with Elise after hours, and the detail that Nadia had met with him twice, because those 2 facts together suggested this was not just romance, and it suggested someone had been treating boundaries as a suggestion. At lunch, I took my car to a quiet side street and opened the folder on my phone where I kept my screenshots, my calendar exports, my merchant alerts, and the dashcam still frame with the time and location stamp. The folder name was dull on purpose, and it looked like nothing important, which made it safer than any password. I reviewed the timeline again, not for obsession, but for structure, because structure is how you keep your head when your life starts trying to turn into noise. I added a short note about the family dinner, the conflicting charity story Elise gave my mother, the moment her phone buzzed, and the notification flashed Grant's initial, and the way she used the word boundaries like a shield. I wrote it down with dates and times, then signed the note digitally with my name as if it were a work summary, because I wanted every entry to feel official, even if it never left my pocket. I was building something that could survive scrutiny, not something that could win a shouting match. When I returned to the office, Rowan caught me near the printer again, and this time their face looked more cautious than curious, which meant the rumor wave had grown teeth. Rowan asked if Elise had contacted me, and I told them she had, but only in vague terms, and I kept my voice calm because I didn't want Rowan to carry my emotion home. Rowan hesitated, then said Nadia Pike had scheduled a private vendor alignment meeting later in the week, and Grant Vale was on the attendee list, which was unusual because vendor alignment was usually procurement's territory, not Nadia's. Rowan did not say what they thought it meant, because the moment you say the suspicion out loud, it becomes a liability, and Rowan was not reckless. Still, they asked me a simple question that landed like a brick. Did I want them to keep an eye out for anything else? I thanked them and said yes, but only for observable facts, not interpretations, because interpretations are what get you accused of being biased. Rowan nodded, and I could tell they respected the way I was handling it, even if they didn't understand why I was being so cold about my own marriage. The truth was, cold was the only temperature that kept this from becoming a story where Elise could claim I was unstable. That evening, Elise called me for the first time since the morning of the suitcases, and the sound of her voice hit my ear like a memory trying to negotiate. She spoke softly, almost gently, and she asked if we could meet somewhere neutral, because she wanted us to talk like adults. The phrase "like adults" sounded flattering, but it was really a trap, because it implied that anything other than her preferred stage was childish. I listened without interrupting, and I let her fill the silence with the kind of reasonable words that make a liar feel safe. Elise said she felt overwhelmed. She said she didn't like how things had escalated. She said she was worried about what people at work were thinking. And that last part told me the real pressure point was not love. It was optics. I asked her, still calmly, to confirm where she had been the night she sent the no-signal message, and I asked it like I was requesting a date on a form. Elise sighed, then said I was fixating, and she accused me of turning everything into an investigation. I almost laughed, because of course she hated the word investigation, and of course she wanted it to be about feelings, because feelings are fog, and fog is her element. I told her I wasn't fixating, I was clarifying, and I said we could meet after she answered one factual question. Elise went quiet, and then she said she had been at her sister's, and she said it fast, like she hoped speed would make it stick. I did not argue, and I did not accuse, and I did not say that I had a merchant alert from a boutique hotel café during her supposed dead zone window. I simply asked her to send a screenshot of her sister's message inviting her over that night, or any note that confirmed the plan, because plans leave traces when they are real. Elise's tone changed immediately, sharper, defensive, and she asked why I needed proof of everything, like proof was a personal insult. I told her that when people's stories change, the only fair thing is to rely on written records, and I kept my voice flat because flat voices do not give you angles. Elise said she didn't have to prove anything to me. Then she said she loved me. Then she said I was making her feel unsafe, and she said it in the exact sequence that made my skin go cold. Unsafe is a word people use when they want the room to look at you differently, and if she was using it on the phone with me, she might already be using it in text with someone else. I ended the call politely, telling her we could speak later, and then I wrote down what she said in my ledger, including the word unsafe, because that word was not a feeling, it was a strategy. The next day at work, the project continuity sync happened in a glass conference room with a view of the city, and the view made everything feel more ridiculous, because the world was still moving while my life was being quietly dismantled. Nadia Pike stood at the head of the table like a person who had never been wrong in her life, and she spoke about performance continuity, risk mitigation, and vendor exposure, using language that turned humans into variables. Elise did not attend, which was not surprising, but Nadia mentioned her name twice as if she were still a factor, and the way she said it felt cautious, like she was protecting herself as much as the company. Grant Vale's name came up on a slide about vendor dependencies, and I watched Nadia's mouth tighten slightly when she said it, because that was the face of someone who knows a vendor has become a problem. People took notes, nodded, and moved on, but I saw the small flickers of awareness, the glances between co-workers that said they sensed the same underlying story. I kept my expression neutral, but inside I was collecting those reactions like secondary corroborations, not as proof of the affair, but as proof that the environment was primed for a controlled truth release. After the meeting, Nadia asked me to stay behind for a moment, and her request came wrapped in polite corporate language that still felt like a summons. The room emptied, the door closed, and Nadia looked at me with the kind of professional calm that pretends it cannot be surprised. She asked how Elise was doing, and she asked it like she was checking a box on a risk checklist. I told her I couldn't speak for Elise's personal situation, and I kept my answer tight because Nadia would use whatever I gave her. Nadia nodded as if she expected that, then said she hoped everything stayed respectful and calm, and she emphasized those words the way people do when they have already heard something else. I told her I intended to keep everything factual and respectful, and I watched her eyes flick down to my hands as if she was checking whether I was shaking. Nadia then said, almost casually, that vendor alignment processes were being reviewed, and that any personal conflicts of interest needed to be disclosed. She did not say Elise or Grant, but she did not have to, because the air in the room had already said it. I asked Nadia what the formal process was for reporting a conflict, and my tone was as neutral as if I were asking about office supplies. Nadia's eyebrow lifted slightly, and she said the process existed, and it was best followed through official channels, and she offered to send me the relevant policy line. I thanked her, and as I left the room I felt something shift again, because Nadia had just shown me the door she wanted me to use, and doors like that are designed to protect the institution, not the people inside it. That night, I went home and opened my binder, then added a new sleeve labeled Language and Narrative, because this was no longer just about where Elise had been, it was about what she was trying to frame. I wrote down the word unsafe again, then I wrote down Nadia's comment about respect and calm, and I wrote down the fact that vendor conflicts were being reviewed. I was not connecting dots in public yet, and I was not accusing anyone of anything, and I was simply noting that the pressure was building in predictable places. Elise wanted a private meeting where she could cry, apologize, blame stress, and get me to react, because reactions are easy to screenshot and hard to explain. Nadia wanted an official channel that would keep the company clean, because clean companies survive and messy people get cut out. Grant Vale was still somewhere in the background, sending messages with the word tonight, scheduling lies like appointments, and relying on the fact that most people hate paperwork enough to avoid it. I sat at my kitchen table, looked at the neat sleeves and the boring labels, and felt the strange comfort of order in the middle of betrayal. Elise had chosen to leave with suitcases at dawn, and she had chosen to treat honesty like a bargaining chip, and now she was choosing language that could ruin me if I let it. I was not going to let it, not by screaming, and not by begging, and not by trying to win her back like she was a prize. I was going to win by being so calm and so documented that anyone who looked at the record would feel embarrassed for ever doubting me. I turned off the lights, left the binder on the table like a quiet threat, and went upstairs knowing the next move would have to be public, procedural, and clean, because private is where she had all the exits, and I was done letting her choose the room. I woke on Wednesday with the kind of focus that only comes when you stop hoping for a different reality and start preparing for the one you have. The air in the house felt colder than usual, not because the heat was off, but because Elise's absence had stripped the rooms of their usual noise, and silence always makes truth louder. I stood at the kitchen counter with my coffee and reviewed the binder again, not because I enjoyed the ritual, but because repetition keeps you from second-guessing yourself when the moment arrives. Calendar exports, merchant alerts, the dashcam still frame, my handwritten dinner notes, the saved invite header, and the policy line Nadia promised to send, all sitting in clean sleeves like they were waiting to be used. The evidence was not dramatic, and it did not need to be dramatic, because the entire point of death by 1,000 truths is that no single fact has to carry the whole weight. A liar survives by turning every accusation into an argument about tone, and my facts had no tone at all. Elise had texted me the night before asking again for a neutral meeting, and she tried to make it sound like a compromise, like she was offering peace. I did not answer with peace, and I did not answer with war, and I answered with a question that forced her to pick one reality. If you want to meet, confirm the time you left Grant's building that night. Her reply came back fast, sharp, and irritated, telling me I was obsessed, telling me I was controlling, telling me I was making her life impossible. That was her pattern now, the same pattern I had heard from claimants who knew the paperwork would not match their story, because when you cannot beat the facts, you attack the person holding them. I read her message twice, then took a screenshot and saved it under narrative, because she was not just lying about where she had been, she was building the kind of framing that could turn me into the problem. Then I set my phone down and made myself breakfast like a normal man, because normal is the most dangerous thing you can be when someone is trying to paint you as unstable. Rowan Pierce texted me mid-morning with a short line that felt like a hinge turning. Elise was seen near the commuter rail platform by the west entrance, and Grant's car was parked in the lot with a temporary pass. Rowan did not add commentary, and they did not ask questions, and that made the information clean. I stared at the message for a moment, then typed back one sentence asking what time, because time is the spine of every lie. Rowan replied with a number, 7:10, and I felt my body react with a quick, unpleasant heat that I immediately pushed down, because anger was useless here and heat would only blur the edges of my thinking. Elise always claimed she hated public scenes, which is why she chose public routines to hide inside, because she knew nobody would look twice at a woman rushing to a train. She had turned a commuter platform into a hiding place, and now she was about to learn that routine locations are terrible for secrecy because routine locations run on clocks. I left my office without announcing it to anyone, using a standard break excuse that did not invite attention, and I drove toward the station with my phone plugged in and my mind locked on one thing. I was not going there to confront her. I was going there to measure her story against the world. The station lot was half full, and the air smelled like wet concrete and diesel, and people moved with their usual commuter impatience, faces forward, minds already ahead of their bodies. I parked at the far edge where the dash cam had a clean line toward the entrance, not because I wanted a spy movie moment, but because my car recorded what it recorded without breaking any laws. I checked the time, 7:06, then I opened the camera view and let it run, because the record matters more than my memory ever will. A few minutes later, I saw Elise's figure emerge near the west entrance, coat pulled tight, hair pinned up, posture composed, as if she was stepping into a role rather than arriving somewhere. She moved with purpose, scanning the crowd in a way that looked casual but was not, because casual scanning does not exist when you are meeting someone you are not supposed to meet. Grant Vale appeared seconds later, and I recognized him by the way he took up space, that confident vendor swagger that pretends charm is a substitute for accountability. He did not kiss her, and he did not grab her, and he kept his hands polite, because he knew public routines have cameras and witnesses, even if nobody is paying attention. Still, their closeness had its own language, the slight tilt toward each other, the way Elise smiled with her mouth but not her eyes, the way Grant leaned in to speak as if their words were private even in open air. I stayed in my car and watched without moving, because movement would have turned this into a scene, and scenes are what Elise wanted so she could claim I was stalking her. Instead, I let them exist in their own pattern, and I let the pattern record itself. A train announcement echoed across the platform, muffled and metallic, and commuters shifted like a herd reacting to a whistle. Elise and Grant moved toward the ticket kiosk area where the crowd thickened, and Elise's phone lit up in her hand. She looked down, typed something quickly, then slipped the phone away like she had done nothing. I noted the time and did what I had promised myself I would do, which was to take the smallest lawful step that created the strongest time anchor. When the next merchant alert came through on my phone, a coffee purchase from the station café on my account, I felt the kind of cold clarity that makes you almost grateful for pain. Elise had used my card before for small purchases, because we had never been the kind of couple who tracked every latte, and now that trust was feeding my ledger like a slow leak feeding a bucket. I did not need to accuse her of anything, because the notification had already spoken. I took a screenshot, then photographed the alert on my phone beside the day's newspaper I kept in my passenger seat from the earlier morning, because context turns a digital line into a dated fact. I left the car only after Elise and Grant disappeared down the stairwell toward the lower platform, and I stayed far enough behind that any reasonable person would have assumed I was just another commuter. My heart was steady, not because I was fearless, but because I had spent days turning my emotions into procedure, and procedure does not panic. When I reached the kiosk area, I bought a bottle of water from the same café and kept the receipt, not because I cared about water, but because receipts carry time in ink. The printed slip showed 718, and I held it for a moment like it was heavier than paper. If Elise later claimed she had been somewhere else at that time, the station itself would disagree, and the station is not a spouse you can gaslight. I stepped aside, took a photo of my receipt next to the platform clock, and saved it in my folder because triangulation is how you lock a lie in place. Rowan was standing near the far end of the platform, not close enough to be involved, but close enough to see what was real. Their expression was careful, like they did not want to be in my story, but could not pretend they were not witnessing it. I walked to them and spoke in a low voice, not to recruit them into revenge, but to confirm what they had already told me. Rowan nodded once and said they had seen Elise arrive with Grant, and they had recognized him because he had been in the office lobby last week with Nadia. That detail landed hard, because it connected 3 points that Elise was trying to keep separate: her affair, her workplace, and the person with procedural power. Rowan did not offer theories, and they did not suggest motives, and they only repeated what they had seen, which kept it clean. I asked Rowan to text me 1 sentence later with the time and the basic observation, nothing emotional, nothing interpretive, because a neutral witness line is stronger than any accusation. Rowan agreed, and the agreement alone felt like the first time someone outside my family had stepped onto the record. Elise emerged again near the turnstiles 20 minutes later, alone this time, moving fast as if she was late for something important. Grant was not with her, and that absence was its own clue, because it suggested he wanted distance when the routine crowd peaked. Elise looked down the platform as if searching, and for a moment her eyes landed on me. The instant was brief, but I saw the shift in her face, that quick tightening around her mouth, the microsecond where calculation replaced composure. She did not walk toward me, and she did not call my name, and she did something worse, something quieter. She took out her phone, typed quickly, and then she looked away as if she had never seen me. That move was pure strategy, because it allowed her to later claim I had imagined the moment, and it allowed her to immediately coordinate with whoever was controlling the script. My phone buzzed with a text from Elise 2 minutes later, and I did not even have to open it to know what it would be. When I did open it, the message read like a pre-written line. "Please stop following me. This is scaring me. You are crossing boundaries." The phrasing was too polished, too symmetrical, too designed, and my skin went cold because I recognized the pattern from the phone call where she first used the word unsafe. She was not texting a feeling, and she was deploying a phrase. I took a screenshot, saved it under narrative, and I did not reply, because replying would create a back and forth she could curate. Instead, I did the only thing that mattered, which was to record the time of her accusation and place it beside the station proof. If she wanted to claim I was stalking her, she would have to explain why her own account was funding her station coffee while she stood beside Grant Vale. Rowan's text arrived a few minutes later, exactly 1 sentence, exactly as promised, stating they saw Elise arrive with Grant at 7:10 near the west entrance. I saved it, then turned my phone face down again, because I was not there to savor the moment. I was there to close a loop. Elise boarded a train and disappeared into the crowd, and I stayed behind, letting the platform return to its ordinary rhythm. I did not chase her onto the train, and I did not call after her, and I did not raise my voice, because if Elise wanted a scene, she would not get one from me. I walked back to my car with my shoulders relaxed and my face neutral, the way you walk when you have nothing to hide, because I didn't. Inside the car, I sat for a full minute, breathing evenly, letting my body catch up to the fact that my marriage had just tried to label me dangerous in a public place, while still living off my shared accounts. On the drive back to the office, I thought about the wording of Elise's text, and I realized something that felt like a twist snapping into place. The message did not sound like Elise when she was emotional, and it sounded like Elise when she was presenting, which meant she was not reacting spontaneously. She was performing a strategy. Grant Vale was not just a lover in the shadows, and he was an organizer, a man who understood how to script a narrative in advance and deploy it at the right moment. That meant the affair was only half the story, and the other half was control, because control is what people chase when they are afraid of consequences. Elise had not packed suitcases at dawn because she wanted clarity, and she had packed them because she wanted leverage. She wanted to leave looking like a victim of a man who snapped, and she wanted to do it before I had time to gather the quiet truths that would make her story collapse. When I returned to my desk, I did not immediately open my folder and stare at the screenshots like a man feeding his own wound. I answered emails, completed a file review, and spoke to a colleague about a routine deadline because I needed the office to see me as stable, boring, and normal. Stability is not just emotional, it is performative, and I was not ashamed to perform it because the alternative was giving Elise a reason to call me erratic. At the end of the day, I went home and placed the new proofs into my binder with the same calm care I used for everything else: the station coffee merchant alert, the dated receipt photo, Rowan's neutral witness line, and Elise's scripted accusation timed to the minute. I labeled the sleeve "Station Routine," and I sat back in my chair for a moment, staring at the neat order of it all. The strangest part was how quiet it still felt, even with the truth sitting right there on my table. Betrayal does not always arrive with shouting, and sometimes it arrives with a polite text and a coffee charge, and a woman who looks through you on a platform like you are already a story she has finished telling. I turned off the kitchen light, left the binder on the table, and walked upstairs knowing I had crossed another threshold. Elise had tried to turn my calm into a threat, and my presence into fear, and she had done it on a platform full of witnesses, and she had done it while my phone captured the receipts that contradicted her. If she wanted to write a narrative, she had just handed me the ink that would ruin it. And she had done it without realizing the only thing more dangerous than an angry husband is a quiet one who keeps records. The morning after the station, the building felt different, like every hallway had learned a new rumor overnight and was trying to decide whether to repeat it. I arrived early on purpose, because arriving early makes you look steady, and steady people do not fit the story Elise was trying to sell. The lobby lights were too bright, the coffee smelled burnt again, and the receptionist's smile looked slightly strained, as if she was unsure which version of me she was supposed to greet. I nodded anyway, kept my expression neutral, and walked to the elevator without scanning for faces, because scanning is what guilty people do when they expect consequences. My phone stayed in my pocket, but my mind stayed sharp because the real fight had moved from my marriage into reputation, and reputation is a battlefield where silence can be a weapon or a wound depending on who controls the record. At my desk, I opened my calendar like a man checking routine obligations, but my eyes went straight to anything that smelled like procedure. Nadia Pike had sent the policy line she promised, a clean excerpt about conflicts of interest, vendor relationships, and disclosure requirements, and the language was blunt in that corporate way that pretends it is neutral while still threatening outcomes. I saved the email with headers visible, then took a screenshot of the relevant policy paragraph on my screen, making sure the date and sender were captured. It felt almost surreal to be collecting policy screenshots like they were love letters, but that was the point, because love had stopped being the shared language in my home. Elise wanted this to be emotional, because emotions are messy, and messy stories get negotiated, and I was building a file that did not negotiate. I printed the policy line and signed the back with the date, not because I thought my signature made it more true, but because it made it harder for anyone to claim I had invented it later. By mid-morning, the team chat had that strange rhythm it gets when people are trying to talk around something big without naming it. Someone asked who was covering Elise's deliverables. Someone replied with a vague mention of temporary reassignment. and then the thread went quiet, as if the silence could protect everyone. I kept responding to work messages with my normal tone, and I made sure my replies were about tasks, deadlines, and measurable outcomes, because the best defense against a smear is being the most boring man in the room. Still, I could feel eyes on me in small moments, a glance at the coffee machine, a pause when I entered a meeting, the slight, over-friendly smile people use when they are afraid you might break. Those reactions were not proof of anything, but they were pressure, and pressure matters because it makes liars hurry. Elise needed the office to believe she was escaping an unstable husband, and the office needed to believe whatever kept the company clean, which meant this could turn ugly fast if I let it. Around noon, Rowan Pierce sent me another short message, clean and factual, saying Grant Vale had been seen on the third floor near Nadia's suite earlier that morning. The third floor was HR territory, the place most people avoided unless summoned, and a vendor wandering there was not normal. I thanked Rowan with one line, then saved their message to my folder because it was another neutral witness observation that drew a line between Grant and procedure. The affair had started in the shadows, but it was now brushing against institutional power, and institutional power does not tolerate mess unless it can control the mess. I understood Nadia's kind of control, because it is the control that fears headlines, fears complaints, fears anything that forces documentation. Elise had tried to claim I was crossing boundaries at the station, and now Grant was crossing boundaries inside the building where boundaries were written into policy. The irony was almost elegant, and I felt no pleasure in it, only a cold certainty that the truth was cornering them faster than they expected. That afternoon, Elise emailed me, not to apologize, not to clarify, and not to offer truth, but to create a record. The subject line was simple, something like, request, and the body asked me to stop contacting her except through email because she felt unsafe and wanted communication to be documented. The word was there again, unsafe, and the repetition confirmed what I already knew, which was that this was not emotion anymore, it was strategy. I read the email twice, then forwarded it to my personal address, saved it with full headers, and took a screenshot of the key sentence. If she wanted documentation, I would give her documentation, but not in the way she expected. I replied with one paragraph, calm and factual, agreeing to communicate through email and requesting that she confirm her address for service of any civil paperwork we might need, and requesting a list of household items she removed. I kept my language neutral because neutral language forces the other person to overplay their hand if they want drama. Elise replied 30 minutes later with accusations, telling me I was weaponizing paperwork, telling me I was threatening her, telling me I was proving her point. I saved that reply too, because she was now creating a written pattern of escalation that she would later pretend belonged to me. When I got home, I did not collapse into self-pity, because self-pity is a luxury, and I was too busy surviving. I opened the binder on my kitchen table and created a new section called Communications, sliding in printed copies of Elise's messages with dates, times, and my calm replies behind them. I then created a one-page timeline sheet, not poetic and not dramatic, listing the dawn text, the dawn arrival with suitcases, the merchant alert at the boutique hotel café, the shifting charity story at my parents' dinner, the station meeting with Grant, the station coffee purchase on my account, and the immediate unsafe and boundaries accusations. I used plain language and short descriptions because plain language makes lies feel childish when placed beside it. I highlighted the dates and times with a marker, then placed the page in a clear sleeve like it was meant to be presented to someone who didn't care about my feelings. That was the entire point, because I needed this to survive an audience that would prefer to believe the version that cost them less discomfort. The next day, Nadia Pike sent a calendar invite titled HR Follow-Up, scheduled for Friday morning, and my stomach tightened in a controlled way that didn't show on my face. Elise was on the invite list too, and Grant Vale was not, which meant Nadia was keeping the vendor separate, at least on paper. The invite location was a small HR conference room on the third floor, and the tone of the invite was almost polite, which meant it was anything but. I saved the invite header, printed it, and placed it into the binder under HR, because nothing in this story mattered if it wasn't documented. Elise emailed me again that night, asking why HR was suddenly involved, and her phrasing was careful, like she was trying to make it look like she had been surprised. I replied with one sentence saying I had no control over HR scheduling, and that she should address questions to Nadia directly. It was true, it was clean, and it denied her the chance to claim I was pulling strings. Elise responded with a longer message accusing me of trying to ruin her career, and she claimed I had shown up at the station to intimidate her. I did not refute the accusation in the email, because refuting it would invite debate, and debate creates screenshots she can crop. Instead, I saved it, and I added it to the pattern. Whenever the record tightened, she escalated the narrative. On Thursday evening, I drove to Mara's place with the binder in my passenger seat, not because I wanted to drag my sister into the mess, but because I needed one person outside the office to see the timeline and tell me if it looked as clean as it felt. Mara opened the door, took one look at my face, and didn't ask if I was okay, because she already knew the answer would waste time. We sat at her kitchen table, and I laid out the documents in order, not like a detective board, but like a file review. Mara read without interrupting, her eyes moving quickly, and when she finished, she tapped the timeline page with her finger and said, "My record was strong because it was boring." She said Elise's unsafe framing was the most dangerous piece, not because it was true, but because it was designed to trigger institutional fear. Mara told me to keep responding in writing, keep it calm, and never, under any circumstances, show anger in a room with HR. She told me to bring only what was necessary, and to avoid speeches, because speeches make you look emotional. Then she asked me a question that cut straight through my numbness. "What do you actually want to happen now?" I stared at the table and realized I had been so focused on proof that I hadn't named the outcome out loud. I told Mara the truth in the simplest form I could trust. I wanted my name clean. I wanted my accounts protected. And I wanted Elise to lose the power to rewrite me as a threat. I also wanted Grant Vale's charm to stop being a shield, because he had helped script a narrative meant to trap me. Mara nodded and said, then my next steps had to be civil and procedural, not vengeful and personal. She suggested I consult an attorney about account separation and a formal written boundary plan, because boundaries, when real, are written by courts and mediators, not by guilty spouses sending texts. I agreed, and we scheduled a time for me to meet a lawyer she trusted the next day, because I needed the paperwork path ready before Elise could weaponize hers. Before I left, Mara looked at me and said something that stuck like a nail. Elise packed those suitcases because she planned to leave as the victim, not as the liar. She said I should remember that in HR, because Elise would try to make Nadia see me as the risk. Friday morning arrived fast, and the air outside the office felt colder than it should have, as if the city itself understood that this was not a normal meeting. I dressed carefully, not to impress, but to look stable, and stability is the enemy of Elise's framing. I carried the binder in a plain bag, because visible binders make people think you are hunting, and I wanted to look like I was complying with process. In the elevator, my reflection looked too calm, and I wondered briefly if I had gone numb. Then I reminded myself that calm was not numbness, it was discipline. When I reached the third floor, the hallway was quieter, carpeted and soft, as if designed to swallow panic. A receptionist asked me to take a seat, and I sat with my hands relaxed on my knees, breathing evenly, because my body was part of the evidence now. Elise arrived 2 minutes later, dressed sharply, eyes bright, posture confident, and she avoided looking at me as if I was a stranger who had once shared her bed. She sat across the hallway, opened her phone and typed quickly, and I recognized the same pattern from the station, the same need to coordinate before the door opened. When Nadia Pike stepped into the corridor and called our names, Elise rose first, smoothing her jacket like she was stepping into court. Nadia's eyes flicked to me, checking for instability, checking for anger, checking for any excuse to frame this as a domestic mess she could refuse. I stood calmly, nodded once, and followed them into the small conference room where the blinds were half closed, and the table was too polished for honesty. Elise sat with her shoulders squared, and Nadia sat at the head like a judge who hated emotion. I placed my bag on the chair beside me and did not open it yet, because the first move was not evidence. It was composure. Nadia began speaking about respectful conduct, personal conflicts of interest, and workplace disruption, and I listened without reacting, because reaction was exactly what Elise wanted. As Nadia spoke, I watched Elise's face for micro-shifts, and I saw it when Nadia mentioned vendor relationships and disclosure. Elise's eyes tightened slightly, her lips pressed together, and she glanced down at her phone as if searching for a lifeline. Nadia asked whether there were any undisclosed conflicts that could impact the company, and Elise began a calm, rehearsed explanation about friendship, mentorship, networking, and misunderstandings. She spoke smoothly, but her story had the same problem it always had, which was that it relied on everyone accepting her tone instead of checking her timestamps. Nadia turned her gaze to me, and I knew the moment had arrived where Elise expected me to explode or beg, and either response would make Nadia side with procedure over truth. I did neither. I took a slow breath, looked at Nadia, and told her I would answer only with documented facts, because I wanted the company protected and the record clear. Nadia's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened, and she nodded once, giving me permission to proceed. I reached into my bag and pulled out a single clear sleeve with one page inside, not the whole binder, not a dramatic stack, just one sheet, because one sheet is harder to frame as obsession. I placed it on the table, slid it forward, and kept my hands relaxed, because relaxed hands look innocent. Elise's eyes dropped to the page, and for the first time since the suitcases, I saw real fear flash across her face, because paper is the one thing charm cannot interrupt. The page I slid across the table was not an accusation, and it was not a speech, because speeches are where liars find openings to claim they were attacked. It was a one-page timeline, printed in plain font, dates and times aligned in neat rows, and it looked so boring it could have been a budget sheet. Nadia Pike leaned forward first, because she could not resist any document that smelled like process, and Elise leaned forward second, because she could not afford to look away. I said nothing for a full beat, letting the paper do its job, because silence makes people read instead of argue. Nadia's eyes moved down the page, pausing where the entries became inconvenient, and Elise's eyes moved faster, not reading, but scanning for the first place she could claim ambiguity. There was not much ambiguity, and that was the point. I had stripped emotion out of the layout until only the spine remained. The dawn text, the dawn arrival with pre-packed suitcases, the boutique hotel café charge on my account inside the dead zone window, the conflicting charity story at my parents' dinner, the commuter station meeting with Grant, the station café charge on my account, and the immediate unsafe accusation delivered minutes after she saw me. Nadia asked, in a controlled voice, whether the merchant alerts were tied to an account I owned, and I answered yes, and I kept the answer short because short answers are hard to twist. Elise opened her mouth to speak, then closed it, and I saw her calculate in real time because she could not deny the account ownership without sounding ridiculous, and she could not admit the charges without collapsing her alibi. Nadia asked if I had documentation of the alerts beyond the printed summary, and I nodded and said yes, and I did not add anything else. Nadia's gaze flicked to Elise, and for the first time in that room, Elise looked smaller, not because she felt guilty, but because the room had shifted away from feelings and toward records. Elise tried to regain control by saying the timeline was invasive and that I had been monitoring her, and she emphasized the word monitoring as if it were a legal term that could scare Nadia into shutting me down. Nadia did not flinch, because Nadia loved documentation more than she loved narrative, and she asked Elise a simple question that landed like a hammer. "Can you explain the merchant charges in the listed time windows?" Elise began with vagueness, saying she had been buying coffee for meetings, running errands, paying for colleagues, and she tried to blur the charges into normal life. Nadia did not let her blur, and she asked Elise to address the specific merchant names and times. Elise pivoted to claiming she must have used the wrong card by accident, and she tried to frame the mistake as careless rather than deceptive. I watched Nadia's face, because Nadia could tolerate carelessness, but she hated undisclosed conflicts, and the words on my sheet suggested a pattern, not a single mistake. I kept my posture relaxed and my hands still, because the best way to survive an institutional room is to look like you belong there. Nadia asked Elise whether Grant Vale had been with her during any of those charges, and Elise said no, too quickly, and the speed of her denial made it sound rehearsed. Nadia asked again, slower, whether Elise had been in Grant's company at the commuter station that Wednesday morning. Elise hesitated, then said she had run into him by chance, and she said the phrase, "run into him," like fate, had tripped her into his arms. Nadia's eyes narrowed slightly, because coincidence is the favorite perfume of people hiding conflict. Nadia then asked whether Elise had disclosed any personal connection to Grant Vale in accordance with the company's conflict policy. Elise said she did not consider it a connection that required disclosure, because he was a vendor contact and she was professional. Nadia turned the policy printout toward Elise, pointing to the line about relationships that could create perceived bias, and she asked Elise to confirm whether she had ever met Grant outside of work contexts. Elise tried to laugh, a small brittle sound, and she said everyone in the industry sees people socially sometimes. Nadia did not laugh, and she asked for a yes or no. Elise paused, then said yes, she had seen him socially, but it was harmless. Nadia asked if she had traveled with him, and Elise said no. Nadia asked if she had stayed at the boutique hotel where the merchant charges originated, and Elise said no again, and this time she looked at me as if I was the one accusing her of a crime. I did not react, because my reaction was what she wanted, and I wanted her to keep talking. Nadia asked, in an even voice, why Elise had emailed me requesting communication through email, because she felt unsafe. Elise said I had been following her and harassing her, and she described the station as stalking, and she used the word intimidation again, as if saying it twice made it true. Nadia asked Elise if she had filed any formal complaint or incident report, and Elise said she had not yet, because she hoped to handle things privately. That sentence was a mistake, because it contradicted her claim of being afraid, and it also suggested she was using the word unsafe as leverage rather than protection. Nadia asked Elise to be specific about what I had done that was threatening. Elise described me being present at a public station, and she described me asking for factual confirmations, and she described my request for her address as controlling. Nadia looked at me and asked for my response, and I gave the only response that could not be framed as aggression. I had not contacted Elise outside of documented messages. I had not threatened her, and I had not asked for anything beyond factual confirmation and standard inventory clarity. I then said one sentence that mattered most in a procedural room. I am willing to follow any written communication protocol HR requires. That sentence did something, because it moved my posture from husband in crisis to employee complying with policy, and Nadia lived in that category. Elise felt the shift too, because she immediately tried to pull the conversation back into emotional territory, saying she did not feel safe, and she felt watched. Nadia acknowledged her feelings in one short line, then returned to the policy, because policy was Nadia's oxygen. Nadia asked whether Elise had packed suitcases before arriving home at dawn, and Elise's face tightened sharply, because she did not expect that detail to be in the room. Elise said she had packed because she needed space, and she tried to make it sound like self-care. Nadia asked why she arrived home at 6:30 with packed bags rather than leaving later, and Elise's answer stumbled, because dawn does not belong to self-care, it belongs to secrecy. Elise said she had been up all night thinking. She said she had stayed at a friend's, and then she caught herself, because she had already told Nadia she had been at her sister's. The slip was small, but it was audible, and small slips are lethal in an HR room because they create documented inconsistency. Nadia asked Elise to clarify whether she had been at her sister's or at a friend's that night, and Elise's eyes darted, searching for the cleanest lie. Elise said her sister was her friend, which was the kind of semantic trick that works in casual conversation and fails in formal settings. Nadia did not accept it, and she asked Elise to provide an address for where she stayed that night for the record, because the company needed clarity around any potential external conflict affecting work. Elise refused, saying it was personal, and Nadia's face hardened almost imperceptibly, because refusal is a problem when you are already under scrutiny. Nadia said the company would not require private addresses unless necessary, but Elise's conflict posture made the issue necessary, and she asked Elise again, calmly, to provide a consistent statement. Elise looked at me, and her eyes carried pure resentment, not fear, because resentment is what people feel when their control tool stops working. Nadia then made the mistake Elise had been waiting for, and it was a mistake that told me something bigger was happening. Nadia said the company had received concerns about a vendor conflict and asked whether Elise had any explanation for why Grant Vale had been on the 3rd floor near HR that week. Elise froze, and the freeze was too clean to be surprise, which meant she had been expecting a question like this but had not planned a good answer. Elise said she had no idea why he was there, and she implied that I must have arranged it, and she implied I was manipulating the company. That implication was absurd, but absurd is not a barrier when you are trying to smear. Nadia looked at Elise for a long moment, then looked at me, and I could see Nadia was weighing which version created less risk for the institution. I didn't give her a version, I gave her a record. I pulled out one more page, not a pile, just the printed witness line from Rowan Pierce, dated, neutral, and simple, stating Grant had been seen near Nadia's suite earlier that morning. I placed it on the table without saying who Rowan was, because names are not needed at first, and because I wanted Nadia to ask for them in process. Nadia read the witness line slowly, and her jaw tightened, because this moved the issue from messy marriage into vendor policy breach. Elise's mouth opened and she started to speak. Then Nadia raised a hand slightly, stopping her, because procedure had finally taken the wheel. Nadia asked Elise if she had instructed Grant to contact HR about anything related to her role, her projects, or her employment status. Elise said no, too fast again. Nadia asked if Elise had shared internal details with Grant that could impact vendor negotiations or procurement fairness. Elise said no again, and her voice sounded higher, thinner, like the room had stolen her depth. Nadia asked Elise to hand over any vendor communications related to Grant's contract for review, and Elise said she did not have them on her because she had been on leave. Nadia said she would request them formally, and the word formally landed like a door locking. Then Nadia turned to me and asked directly whether I had any intention of filing a formal complaint or whether my goal was simply to protect my workplace environment from spillover. The question was a test, because if I said revenge, she could frame me as a risk, and if I said nothing, she could ignore my documentation. I answered with the truth in the only form Nadia respected. My goal was to ensure a clear record, prevent false claims, and follow company policy regarding conflicts that could affect vendor integrity. Elise stared at me like I had betrayed her in a way she couldn't forgive, because she had expected me to play husband, not policy witness. Nadia nodded once, and I understood that Nadia had found the path she preferred, the path where she could treat Elise and Grant as a compliance issue rather than a domestic drama. Nadia concluded the meeting by stating that HR would open a formal review of potential vendor conflict and conduct, and that both Elise and I would be expected to communicate through written channels only until further notice. She told Elise to refrain from contacting vendors about internal HR matters, and she told me to refrain from contacting Elise except for necessary logistics through email. Elise tried to object, saying this was unfair and invasive, but Nadia cut her off with a calm line about protecting all parties and the company. Elise stood abruptly, chair scraping slightly, and for a second I thought she might finally lose control and say something honest out of pure rage. Instead, she grabbed her bag, looked at Nadia, then looked at me, and her eyes promised retaliation, not reconciliation. She left the room without another word, and the door closed behind her with a soft click that felt louder than any shout. Nadia remained seated and looked at me with the clinical calm of someone who had just chosen the least risky route. She told me she appreciated my factual approach, and she said that any further concerns should be submitted in writing with documentation. I nodded, thanked her, and stood to leave without adding commentary, because the less you say after a meeting like this, the less there is to twist later. In the hallway, my hands were steady, and my breathing stayed even, and I walked past Elise without looking at her, because looking at her would be permission to make this personal. As I reached the elevator, my phone buzzed, and the message was from Elise, already rewriting the meeting into her version, already calling me vindictive, already claiming I had orchestrated everything. I didn't reply, and I didn't even read it twice, because the true shift had already happened. Elise had lost control of the room, and the room was the only place her lies could survive. Over the next week, HR moved with the quiet speed of a machine that only looks slow when you are not the target. The office didn't announce anything, and nobody sent dramatic emails, but the small signals multiplied, the kind of signals only a careful person notices. Elise's access to certain vendor folders stopped updating, meetings reshuffled without her name, and Nadia Pike's assistant began appearing in conversations where she never used to appear, like a shadow marking the perimeter. People avoided my eyes more than before, not because they blamed me, but because they were afraid the truth had sharp edges and might cut them too. I kept my routine unchanged, arrived early, worked steadily, and spoke in the same measured tone to everyone, because stability is the only shield that works against whispers. Elise, meanwhile, tried a new tactic, and it arrived disguised as generosity. She emailed me a proposal for a mutual separation agreement, written in friendly language, offering to keep things civil if we both agreed to move on without involving third parties. The phrase "without involving third parties" was the giveaway, because she wasn't talking about lawyers, she was talking about HR. She wanted me to close the institutional door before it could close on her. She framed the agreement as a peace offering, but it read like a muzzle, and I understood why. The HR review had shifted the story out of her control, and she needed to pull it back into private negotiation, where her tone could do the heavy lifting. I replied with one short paragraph, thanking her for the message, stating I would review any proposal through counsel, and asking her to confirm whether she intended to reimburse the charges made on my account during her claimed no-signal window. That last line wasn't petty, and it wasn't about money, it was about anchoring her in reality. Elise responded with anger, accusing me of humiliating her, accusing me of trying to ruin her livelihood, and insisting she would protect herself. I saved the exchange, printed it, and placed it into the binder because she was writing her own escalation in ink. 2 days later, Mara's lawyer, a calm mediator type who spoke in clean sentences, told me to do 3 things immediately: separate discretionary spending on any shared accounts, document all communication, and stop meeting Elise in person without a witness or written agenda. I followed all 3 without drama. I submitted a civil request to separate spending authorization, using the bank's standard procedure, and I saved the confirmation screen that proved it was processed. Then I sent Elise a single email informing her of the separation request, explaining it as a standard protection step during marital dispute, and offering to review any contested expenses calmly. She replied that I was financially abusing her, and she accused me of trapping her, and the words financial abuse were another strategic phrase designed to trigger fear in institutions. The problem for her was that my action had a date, a procedure, and a confirmation number, and her accusation had only tone. I saved her email, not to savor it, but to show the pattern, because patterns are what win when stories collide. On Friday, a new invite appeared on my calendar, a formal HR review session scheduled for the following Tuesday. The invite title was plain Compliance Review, and the attendee list included Nadia Pike, Elise, and a vendor compliance officer I had never met. Grant Vale's name was not listed, but the presence of a compliance officer told me Grant was the real subject, even if he was not in the room. Elise emailed me that night, pleading in a softer tone, saying she felt blindsided, saying she didn't know how things got this far, saying she wanted to talk like we used to. I read the message and felt a brief flicker of something human, the old habit of wanting to repair. Then I remembered the station platform and the immediate unsafe text, and the flicker died. I replied with one line stating I would only communicate through email, and that any discussions about agreements should go through counsel. Her next message arrived 3 minutes later, and it was pure venom, calling me cold, calling me calculating, and saying she would tell her story if I kept pushing. I didn't reply, because I didn't need to, and because her threat revealed a key truth. She still believed story could beat record. Tuesday arrived with rain that made the parking lot shimmer like an oil slick, and the building lobby felt unnaturally quiet, as if everyone sensed an invisible meeting was about to change someone's life. I reached the 3rd floor early and waited in the carpeted corridor outside the conference room, hands relaxed, posture neutral, the same controlled presence that had saved me before. Elise arrived 5 minutes later, walking fast, eyes bright, jaw tight, and she avoided looking at me as if eye contact might acknowledge something she could not control. Nadia Pike arrived last with the compliance officer, a woman named Lorna Hale, whose expression was so neutral it could have been manufactured. They called us into the room, closed the door, and the air inside felt colder than the hallway, because rooms like this are designed to make feelings irrelevant. Nadia opened with the same procedural script, then handed the floor to Lorna Hale, who asked Elise a series of questions about vendor contact, meeting locations, and any social interactions that could create perceived bias. Elise attempted calm answers, but her calm had cracks now because she had been on defense for too long. Lorna asked for documentation of vendor communications, and Elise said she didn't have it with her, and Lorna replied that IT had already preserved relevant correspondence as part of the compliance process. Elise's face changed at that line, and it was the clearest sign yet that she had been relying on deletion and vagueness. Lorna clarified that preservation was standard and did not imply guilt, but Elise's reaction made it imply guilt anyway, because innocent people don't flinch at standard procedure. Then Lorna asked Elise about the boutique hotel café charges tied to my account during her alleged no-signal period, and Elise tried to dismiss them as a card mix-up again. Lorna asked whether Elise could provide a consistent explanation of her location during that window, because the company had reason to believe vendor contact occurred outside approved contexts. Elise said she had been at her sister's. Then she said she had stepped out for fresh air. Then she said she had met a friend briefly, and each new clause felt like a patch sewn onto a rip. Nadia watched without expression because Nadia didn't care about excuses. She cared about how messy the excuses were. Lorna asked Elise if she had met Grant Vale at the commuter station on the morning Rowan witnessed, and Elise said she had run into him by chance again. Lorna asked whether she could explain why his car had a temporary station pass, And Elise froze, because you cannot run into a man who planned parking. The room went quiet in that tight way that makes your ears ring, and Elise started to speak, then stopped, as if she finally realized every additional word could become a recorded contradiction. Lorna asked Elise whether she had ever discussed HR matters with Grant Vale, and Elise said no. Lorna then said evenly that Grant Vale had contacted HR directly to request clarification on vendor alignment processes and that he had referenced Elise's name in that request. Elise's face drained of color, and for the first time I saw actual panic break through her performance. Grant had crossed into HR and he had dragged her name with him, and the compliance officer was stating it like a fact, not an accusation. Elise tried to claim she had no knowledge of it, but the words came out too fast, too desperate, and desperation is the opposite of credibility. Nadia asked Elise a single question that felt like the hinge on a door. Had she instructed Grant to contact HR, directly or indirectly? Elise said no. Nadia asked whether she had shared internal complaints, timelines, or strategies with him about my alleged intimidation. Elise hesitated, then said she might have vented, but it wasn't serious. That admission landed heavier than she expected, because venting to a vendor about domestic issues tied to workplace policy is not venting, it is contamination. Lorna noted the admission in her notes without emotion, and Nadia's eyes narrowed slightly, because a line had been crossed, and now it was on the record. At that moment, Elise tried to pivot into the one weapon she still trusted, public narrative. She accused me again of stalking her at the station, and she said my presence had frightened her. Lorna asked if Elise had filed any incident report with transit security or police. Elise said no. Lorna asked if Elise had any witness statement supporting her claim beyond her own account. Elise said no. Nadia then asked Elise why she had used my account for café purchases if she felt unsafe around me, because shared accounts imply shared trust, and unsafe narratives collapse when money flows the wrong direction. Elise's mouth opened, and nothing came out, because there is no clean answer to that. The room stayed quiet, and I realized this was the moment where Elise's control had finally slipped, not because I attacked her, but because procedure had cornered her into contradictions. After the meeting, Nadia announced interim measures in the same calm tone she used for routine policy updates. Elise was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the compliance review, and she was instructed not to contact vendors, not to access certain systems, and not to communicate with staff about the matter. Nadia stated these measures were standard and were not a final decision, but her words carried the weight of consequences. Elise stood abruptly, chair scraping louder than necessary, and she stared at Nadia as if Nadia had betrayed her personally. Then she turned her gaze on me, and her eyes were not pleading now, they were furious, because she understood I had stopped playing spouse and started playing record. She said one sentence through clenched teeth, that she would make me regret this, and Nadia immediately reminded her that threats in an HR room would be documented. Elise stopped, swallowed, grabbed her bag, and left without another word. In the hallway, Elise's phone buzzed, and she glanced down at it with a look that was almost hopeful. Then her face tightened, and she shoved the phone into her pocket. I realized then that Grant, the man she thought was a partner in control, was not in the room, and he wasn't taking the hits with her. That realization hit like a late twist, snapping into place. Grant had been using her as a shield, and she had been using him as an escape, and now both of them were trapped by the same thing they underestimated, which was documentation. I walked to the elevator alone, breathing evenly, and the rain outside the windows looked heavier, like the city was pressing down to keep everything contained. My phone buzzed with a new email from Elise, long and frantic, accusing me of everything under the sun and begging me to stop before it gets worse. I saved it without replying, because I didn't need her to admit guilt in writing, and she was already doing something more useful. She was proving she had no stable narrative left, and when a liar loses narrative control, The next move is always either a public stunt or an escape. The next morning, Elise tried the only move she had left, which was to turn the story public before the Record could finish its work. A mutual friend tagged a vague post about surviving control, and within an hour, the office group chat started buzzing with half questions and careful sympathy. I did not reply, and I did not argue, and I did not ask anyone to defend me, because public debates are where facts get drowned by emotion. Instead, I walked into the building with the same steady pace, went straight to my desk, and forwarded the tag screenshot to my personal folder, because even her theatrics had timestamps. Rowan messaged me that a special staff update had been scheduled for noon, and Nadia Pike's name was on the invite, along with Lorna Hale from compliance. That meant Elise had forced a pressure point, and the company was choosing to cut it cleanly in front of witnesses because a rumor is a liability until you nail it to a record. At 11:55, I entered the all-hands room and took a seat near the back, not to hide, but to avoid becoming the center of anyone's gaze. People spoke softly, chairs scraped, and the air felt charged in that restrained corporate way that pretends it is calm while everyone is hungry for clarity. Elise arrived late, wearing the same sharp coat she had worn to my parents' dinner, and she scanned the room like she was looking for allies. Grant Vale appeared behind her, and that was the moment I understood the late twist in full. He wasn't just avoiding the fallout, he was trying to redirect it by showing up as if he belonged here. Security stopped him at the door because his badge had been revoked, and the refusal was quiet but public, and the color drained from Elise's face when she realized his access was already controlled by policy. Grant tried to argue politely, and the guard pointed to a printed notice, and Grant's charm died in the space between paper and authority. Nadia Pike stepped onto the small stage with Lorna Hale, and the room quieted the way it does when process enters. Nadia stated there was an active compliance matter involving vendor conflicts and employee conduct, and she said the company would not discuss private details, but it would confirm procedural outcomes that affected staff integrity. Elise stood before anyone invited her, and she said she was being targeted because she tried to protect herself from an unstable spouse. Nadia did not engage the emotional claim, and she simply asked Elise to sit, reminding her that this was a workplace forum, not a personal dispute. Elise refused, and she demanded to tell her story, and the demand itself became the spectacle she claimed she feared. Lorna Hale then delivered the decisive blow without raising her voice. She stated that the compliance review had confirmed undisclosed vendor contact outside approved contexts, and that a vendor representative had attempted to involve HR in a personal narrative tied to an employee's allegations. She said the company had documented inconsistencies in location statements, confirmed misuse of a spouse-linked payment method during disputed time windows, and logged an improper attempt to influence internal procedure. She did not say affair, and she did not need to, because everyone in the room heard the shape of it. Nadia announced the outcome in the simplest terms. Elise's employment was terminated for cause due to verified policy breaches and failure to cooperate consistently with the review. She added that the vendor relationship with Grant's firm was being terminated under a contract clause, and that Grant's access had been revoked permanently. Elise tried to speak again, but her voice cracked under the weight of a room that no longer needed her story. Grant raised his hand from the doorway like he could still negotiate, and security stepped closer, not aggressively, but decisively, and he backed away because he understood public authority when it appeared. Nadia concluded the update by stating that staff should not engage in gossip and should route any concerns through formal channels. Then she stepped off the stage, and the meeting ended the way corporate meetings always end, with chairs moving and people pretending they were not shaken. I did not chase Elise, and I did not gloat, and I did not offer comfort, because comfort would have made me part of her performance again. I walked out at the same pace I walked in, and my phone buzzed with a final email from her, begging me to fix it, to call Nadia, to tell them it was a misunderstanding. I stared at the message for a moment, then saved it, because it proved the last thing I needed. She still believed consequences were negotiable if she could manipulate the right person. I opened a new email, addressed it to my lawyer, attached the termination notice summary and the key ledger pages, and I typed one line requesting immediate filing for separation terms and account protections. When I hit send, the feeling was not victory, and it was not relief, and it was the cold clarity of a man who finally understood that the truth does not scream, it only accumulates, and then it ends you in front of everyone,